Some people always post smiling photos, captions glowing with effortless positivity. You have seen their timelines filled with celebrations, vacations, laughter, constant brightness. Their online presence feels lighter than the way they behave in person. They appear cheerful publicly, yet strangely distant during private conversations. It looks like confidence, success, or simply a naturally happy personality. Yet something about the performance feels slightly rehearsed and carefully arranged. The happiness seems louder on screens than in real rooms. This pattern appears harmless, even admirable, in everyday scrolling habits. But it often hides a quiet psychological reflex most people never question. Once noticed, this contrast begins appearing in unexpected places. What looks like joy on the surface reveals something deeper underneath, and its origin explains far more than curated photos and cheerful captions. Scrolling through social media often feels like walking through a gallery of carefully edited emotional displays. Faces appear relaxed, joyful, and fulfilled, framed within moments that seem effortlessly meaningful. Yet meeting the same individuals offline sometimes reveals a noticeable emotional difference. Their energy feels heavier, conversations feel shorter, and enthusiasm appears more difficult to sustain. This contrast is commonly dismissed as normal differences between public and private behavior. People assume everyone presents a slightly improved version of themselves in public spaces. However, the consistency of exaggerated positivity begins to reveal a deeper psychological pattern. The repeated display of happiness often functions as more than simple self-expression. Psychologist Carl Jung observed that what people show repeatedly may conceal what they struggle to confront internally. The smiling images become less about sharing joy and more about maintaining emotional stability. Posting happiness can feel like proof that things are still under control internally. The individual may not consciously intend to deceive others or create false impressions. Instead, they are unconsciously regulating uncomfortable emotions through visible demonstrations of positivity. This behavior is easier to notice in others because it feels slightly artificial when observed externally. Friends sometimes sense the difference, but cannot clearly explain why the positivity feels strained. In group chats, this person sends cheerful messages while avoiding deeper personal discussions. At family gatherings, they smile often but rarely speak about their current emotional state. In workplaces, they appear upbeat yet avoid conversations that require emotional honesty. What looks like emotional strength is often an attempt to prevent internal emotions from surfacing. The mind learns that displaying happiness publicly reduces the need to process discomfort privately. Behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner noted that behaviors reducing emotional discomfort are quickly reinforced without awareness. Each positive post brings small social validation that temporarily eases internal tension. Over time, the habit becomes automatic whenever emotional discomfort begins to rise. The person starts believing they are naturally positive because they see constant evidence of it online. Meanwhile, their unexpressed emotions remain unprocessed, accumulating quietly beneath the surface. What others interpret as happiness is often a form of emotional self-protection. This pattern did not begin with social media or adulthood. Its roots trace back to much earlier experiences where visible positivity had psychological advantages.
If you're still watching, you probably notice things most people miss. You question behavior, you look beneath the surface. If that sounds like you, subscribe. This channel was made for minds like yours.
Long before social platforms existed, children learned that visible cheerfulness often softened adult reactions. Smiling after mistakes sometimes reduced criticism more effectively than explaining genuine confusion or distress. In many homes, appearing fine prevented deeper questioning about uncomfortable feelings or unmet needs. The child discovered that positive expressions could redirect attention away from internal emotional turbulence. Over time, the brain associated outward happiness with emotional safety and reduced interpersonal scrutiny. This association formed quietly through repeated experiences that required emotional self-regulation for acceptance. Parents, teachers, and caregivers often praised resilience when children hid sadness behind polite smiles. The child who appeared cheerful was seen as strong, cooperative, and easy to manage. Meanwhile, visible distress often invited correction, advice, or subtle forms of emotional dismissal. Psychologist Winnicott described how children develop a false self to maintain connection with caregivers. This false self does not arise from deception, but from the need to preserve attachment and stability. Displaying happiness becomes part of that adaptive identity designed to maintain relational harmony. The nervous system records this strategy as effective for reducing emotional exposure and vulnerability. As the child grows, this pattern detaches from its original context and becomes habitual. They no longer remember why expressing sadness feels uncomfortable in shared spaces. Evolutionary psychology also explains why visible emotional stability carried social advantages in early groups. Individuals who appeared emotionally composed were less likely to be perceived as burdensome or unstable. Projecting well-being increased social acceptance and reduced the risk of exclusion. These ancient pressures quietly shaped how humans learned to present emotional states publicly. The brain does not distinguish between ancestral group survival and modern social environments. It simply repeats patterns that historically reduced emotional risk and preserved belonging. Neuroscientists describe this as the brain favoring familiar emotional safety loops over honest emotional expression. The person feels a subtle urge to appear fine even when internal discomfort is present. They experience relief after displaying positivity, reinforcing the habit without conscious reflection. Eventually, they believe this is simply their personality rather than an adaptation. This is how childhood emotional conditioning becomes an adult social reflex. And this reflex begins to show itself clearly in everyday social relationships and interactions. This pattern becomes noticeable in friendships where emotional honesty is quietly expected but rarely practiced. One friend constantly shares cheerful updates while avoiding conversations about personal struggles or disappointments. Others sense a distance that cannot be explained by words or visible behavior. The friendship feels active on the surface, yet emotionally shallow beneath casual exchanges. In romantic relationships, this behavior appears when one partner insists everything is fine during difficult periods. They reassure repeatedly, smile often, and minimize concerns that clearly require deeper discussion. The other partner gradually feels excluded from an emotional world that remains carefully guarded. What looks like emotional stability begins to feel like emotional inaccessibility over time. Family interactions also reveal this pattern during gatherings filled with polite smiles and light conversation. A relative appears joyful in photos, yet avoids discussing recent personal challenges privately. Attempts to ask meaningful questions are gently redirected towards safer, more cheerful topics. The person leaves appearing socially present while remaining emotionally distant from everyone involved. In workplaces, colleagues who appear consistently upbeat often avoid sharing stress or dissatisfaction openly. They maintain professional positivity while privately struggling with pressure, burnout, or quiet frustration. Supervisors interpret this as resilience, unintentionally reinforcing the emotional masking behavior. Meanwhile, coworkers may feel confused by the gap between visible energy and subtle emotional withdrawal. Social environments reward visible happiness because it feels comfortable and non-disruptive to group dynamics. People who express sadness or frustration openly are often seen as creating emotional discomfort. Psychologist Eric Fromm noted that many social interactions prioritize harmony over authenticity. This encourages individuals to display acceptable emotions rather than genuine emotional experiences. The behavior becomes easier to recognize in others because it feels slightly performative when observed. People notice the constant brightness without recognizing similar tendencies within themselves. The pattern hides behind politeness, positivity, and the desire to be socially easy to engage with. Over time, relationships adapt around this emotional performance without anyone naming it directly. What appears like happiness subtly reshapes how people connect, communicate, and understand one another. And modern life quietly intensifies this pattern far beyond traditional social settings. Digital platforms provide constant opportunities to display curated emotional states without revealing internal complexity. Photos, captions, and short updates allow happiness to be presented without emotional depth or context. The structure of social media favors moments that appear joyful, successful, and visually appealing. Sadness, confusion, and emotional struggle rarely fit the format of shareable online content. As a result, users learn which emotions receive attention and which ones remain invisible. Each positive post generates small signals of approval through likes, comments, and subtle validation. This feedback loop reinforces the habit of presenting emotional brightness during internal difficulty. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman described how repeated rewards strengthen fast, automatic behavioral patterns. Online approval becomes a quick emotional relief that discourages deeper personal reflection. The individual feels briefly seen without needing to expose genuine vulnerability publicly. Cultural expectations also contribute by equating visible happiness with success and personal stability. People begin to feel pressure to maintain a consistent emotional image across their digital presence. Silence online can feel like social disappearance, encouraging frequent cheerful updates. This mirrors older survival instincts where visible well-being signaled belonging within a group. Workplaces increasingly blur with digital life, requiring constant professional positivity across platforms. Colleagues maintain upbeat personas and messages while privately feeling overwhelmed or emotionally depleted. The gap between internal state and external display gradually widens without conscious awareness. Over time, individuals lose comfort with expressing neutral or complex emotions publicly. They become accustomed to performing happiness as a default social expression. This performance requires energy that quietly drains emotional resources over long periods. Friends and followers consume the image without seeing the cost behind its maintenance. The person begins to confuse their displayed happiness with their actual emotional condition. Neurological loops strengthen as the brain associates posting positivity with reduced emotional tension. The pattern expands from occasional behavior into a central part of identity expression. What feels socially rewarded begins to carry an invisible psychological cost. Noticing this cost creates an awareness that feels difficult to ignore once seen clearly. And this awareness leads toward a more unsettling internal recognition. Eventually, the contrast between displayed happiness and internal emotion becomes difficult to overlook personally. Moments arise when posting something cheerful feels strangely disconnected from actual emotional experience. The act of smiling for a photo begins to feel slightly rehearsed rather than spontaneous. After sharing positive updates, a quiet emptiness sometimes lingers longer than expected. This realization does not feel dramatic, but quietly unsettling and persistent. Psychologist Carl Rogers noted that awareness often arrives before emotional change becomes possible. The mind starts noticing how often positivity appears during moments of internal discomfort. Conversations replay internally, revealing how rarely genuine feelings were expressed honestly. The individual begins recognizing how much effort goes into maintaining a consistent emotional image. This effort feels heavier once it becomes visible to conscious thought. Pauses in daily life reveal emotions that were previously masked by constant cheerful activity. Silence without performance begins to feel unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. The urge to post something uplifting becomes easier to observe, yet difficult to resist. In social settings, similar patterns become noticeable in many people at the same time. Rooms feel filled with polite positivity, while deeper emotional realities remain unspoken. Friends, colleagues, and relatives appear connected outwardly while remaining internally guarded. Behavioral scientist Albert Bandura emphasized how social patterns spread through quiet observation and imitation. Recognizing this reveals how widespread and mutually reinforced the behavior has become. The realization carries tension because no one appears intentionally dishonest or deceptive. Everyone seems to be protecting themselves while gradually losing emotional authenticity. What once felt like happiness begins to resemble emotional self-preservation. The difference between genuine joy and displayed joy becomes subtly clearer internally. This clarity does not remove the habit, but changes how it feels when it occurs. What once felt natural now feels slightly staged and emotionally revealing. The mind senses the gap between expression and experience without fully closing it. And this unresolved awareness lingers quietly after the screen goes dark,